Okay, this should be a very straightforward video about how to create a simple pipeline that allows you to get assets from Blender and LightWave into Unity without too much hassle. So the first thing we want to do is, what we're trying to do is create a simple way to get your textures and your materials and everything else to line up easily. So what I'm going to do is create a folder in Unity called Textures. I'm going to drag my UV file into it, which in this case is just a procedural clouds thing I made in Photoshop. Then we're going to head into Blender, and here we are in Blender. This is the default setup. I'm going to enter active mode and then use the UV unwrap tool. Push this stuff off to the side, get a second viewport here and set that to UV. That's what the UV automatically looks like. It's similar to unwelding all the faces and doing a UV unwrap in LightWave. And so we'll get a slightly different result out of this than we'll get out of LightWave, but that's okay. And then we're going to go to the Material tab here where it says Material. We want to change that so that it's the same as this file here. Okay? The reason is because we're going to have to do a little bit of setup here in Unity, and it's just going to make things a little bit easier. So even though this is all lowercase in Blender, we're going to call this Material. We're going to rename this Chilton UV. Okay, now this could be anything. It doesn't obviously have to be Chilton UV. If this was a window for a car, it might be called Car Window or whatever. But the idea is to use a same or similar name here for Material as the actual file that you are going to use as a texture. Okay, so now we've done this, and we're going to export this as a FBX file. Okay, and we're going to call this Blender box, and we'll put it in this folder. There we go. We're done. Now, here we are in Unity, and we're going to drag that Blender box file in, and what you see is it automatically generates a proxy, temporary, whatever you want to call it, material, because it couldn't find one. It was looking for a material called Chilton UV. If you're wondering why that is, if you look at the actual FBX file and you look for a material, with the 2 colons after it, you will see that Blender, when it exported this file, it said that the material would be called Chilton UV. Okay, so here we are in Unity, and it has created a material called Chilton UV to match the one in this FBX file. Now, let's say that you are using a different app, and in this case I'll use LightWave, and we're going to create a box, and we're going to create a similar, it's basically a 1 meter box, and we'll create it there on the origin. And let's say that this represents a file, a car, whatever, from a different app, or maybe one you bought online or whatever, and it has its own UV maps. In this case, since I'm in LightWave, I'm going to create a UV map that we're going to call temp map, just to show kind of the workflow here. It's an atlas map, and so it's going to create this. It's going to unwrap it a little bit, put it like this. And in our surface editor, we're going to take this. Now, I've already done this, but we would want to rename our surface to Chilton UV. Again, we want the surface in LightWave to reflect the name of the file that we're going to use as our texture. This is only for simplicity's sake. It's not a necessary thing. It just makes our job a lot easier. So I make sure that our projection is set to UV and that we're using a UV map, use that texture, and we are done. Okay, so that's all we have to do in LightWave, and then we export the FBX file. Again, we'll put it in the same folder, and we're going to call this one LightWave box.fbx. So back in Unity, now remember when we dragged the Blender box in, it created a material called Chilton UV. Now, if you'll notice here, if I take my LightWave box and drag that in, it will not create another material. And the reason is because my LightWave box also, if you look for a material, lists Chilton UV as the active material. Okay, so it didn't need to make another material. It already knew that Chilton UV was going to be used. So now we've got these 2 assets in here, and if you look at these boxes here that are blank, well, we're going to go to Materials, and we drag our texture onto this right here, and now it shows the texture as being this little circle like this. If we now look at the Blender box and the LightWave box, Both of them have the UV applied to them. Okay. So despite that, we have that those two tools have different ways of applying that UV map initially. It's actually just because I use two different tools, a different tool in each app. You'll notice that the UV maps are applied. They're using the same texture, and it was very easy to set up. If I want to change this later and I want to make this red, there you go. That's all it takes. See? That's it. That is all it takes. And we're done. So you remember, make sure the material, either in whatever app you're using, make sure that the material is always the same as the name of the texture that we want to be using. And that will greatly simplify everything for the pipeline. There you go.